From the California State Senate, this is Senate Spotlight.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this segment of Senate Spotlight, where we discuss legislative priorities, policy, and other related issues with members of the California State Senate. From the state capitol here in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green, and our guest this time around is State Senator Marty Block, representing the 39th Senate District down in beautiful San Diego. Welcome to the program, sir.
Great to be with you again, Brian.
Glad to have you, and you, of course, are also chair of the Senate Budget Subcommittee 1 on education, and that's just perfect for this discussion we're going to have today about budget and education, so we'll get into both of those. And might as well just get right to it. Let's just talk as we speak here. The ink is drying on Governor Brown's May budget revision, the May revise, as we call it here in Sacramento, this $96.4 billion state budget. Now, in contrast to where we were a couple of years ago, and you've seen it as a legislator, as a senator and an assembly member, we found some light at the end of the tunnel. We're no longer in this sort of crisis reflex with the state budget. How does it feel, as a legislator who's seen the worst of it, to see something looking so much more promising?
Well, it's great to have things be as much better as they are. But frankly, folks were a little bit disappointed yesterday that things weren't even better. A lot of us had anticipated maybe a $4 or $5 billion surplus over what the governor had budgeted in January. He's telling us now it's only about $2.8 billion. So there was some initial disappointment, but the overall picture, particularly compared to 2009 when I got here, it's very optimistic. We're definitely moving in the right direction. In 2009, we had a $52 billion deficit. So having money to start to restore some of the programs we've had to cut over the years is great.
Well, as you mentioned, he did project less for this May revise than he did in January. In fact, they're projecting less for next year's fiscal year. Tell us for the reason for this. Do you think the governor's wise in being so fiscally modest with the way he's putting this out?
Well, he's being very fiscally conservative. He's looking at things on the federal level in particular, like the 2% payroll tax increase, the federal sequestration, as being real danger signs for California and California's economy and how much consumers in California might spend and thus pay in sales tax to the state. So he's being very conservative. That's probably prudent, but we think we'll get numbers from the legislative analysts that will hopefully be higher and tell us we have a little more to deal with, because we want to be fiscally prudent, but we certainly want to restore programs that have hurt people in California. Cuts have hurt for many years now. It's time to get people back on their feet.
Well, the governor said, "Don't break out the champagne." That was his quote. But do you think Prop 30 had a great deal to do with that last November, the voters' approval of that brought us to this comfort space where we are today?
Yeah, Prop 30 was huge, and any viewers who voted for Prop 30 should pat themselves on the back, because we are in a much better place today because of that.
Well, the biggest winners this year, particularly after being the biggest losers for a decade, are the schools. So with this $4.5 billion tax plus, maybe more, depending on what the legislative analyst says by the end of this week, giving it all to K through 12 and higher ed. A lot of it, I think, just for one-time uses, though. Or should we just be thankful that the schools are getting this, especially after being such a parched landscape for so long?
Yeah, under the strange mechanics of Prop 98, almost all of the additional money will go to the schools. And the schools have been cut so severely that they really can use the money. And the governor is proposing that this money be divvied up in a brand new way, a more simplistic way than it's been divided before, a way that gives more flexibility to districts. He's calling it his local control funding formula. And it's also a way that gives more money to students most in need, which I think most of us in the legislature think is a very good thing.
Well, the governor has said that his local funding formula, he says it's moral, it is just. And in theory, Democrats would probably agree with this, but there's been some issue within Democratic lawmakers here at the state capitol about how that money is being divvied up. And while it is the concern to make sure that we help the low-income communities and the schools, there is a concern that the districts that may be in more prosperous areas of the state still have a low-income or a needy school district or a needy school that may get left out of the loop of this. So obviously, this is your politics, helping out yours, meaning the Democratic caucus, helping out those who need it the most, but are we leaving some kids without a safety net by following the governor's plan?
Sure, well, there's a real tension between trying to raise all districts, because all districts have suffered huge cuts in the last 4 years, and particularly targeting those most in need. Now, the governor said in his State of the State that treating people in unequal circumstances equally is injustice. As a result, he really is targeting funds to English learners, to folks with lower incomes, but he's also targeting money for areas, for districts where there's a big concentration of folks with low income and English learners. And some of my Senate colleagues think that's a mistake. They like to take that money and make it part of the base of all districts. Reasonable minds can differ on that. What we're really talking about, though, is only 4% of the budget. On 96% of the governor's budget, there's pretty good agreement now between, I think, the legislature and the governor.
Well, one the other concern is, too, is that if we cherry pick the governor's plan too much, we could be right back where we started from, where we are now, where the locals are so heavily dependent on categoricals and too much state decision-making in the funding that we haven't gained anything.
Right, and the governor has shown he's listening to us. His May revise includes accountability mechanisms that weren't in his original proposal. And I and my colleagues were concerned about lack of accountability. He's addressed that. It also includes $1 billion for teachers to be better prepared to work with Common Core curriculum, which is coming next year. And that's another thing that we in the legislature urged the governor to include in the revise.
So that is where he listened to you.
Yeah,
then.
It's a give and take, but he has been listening.
And what does that mean? Tell us, for those who may not know the vernacular, what is Common Core standards and what do teachers and schools have to do to get geared up for it?
Well, Common Core in math and English, the idea is to have one common set of standards, not just in the state of California, but throughout the country. And countries that have really had success in education usually have a common core of principles that the entire country subscribes to. We haven't done that in the United States, and we're moving in that direction. And for California to now move to Common Core next year, which is the plan, teachers will need to be trained, additional instructional materials need to be purchased, and the governor's original budget didn't provide any dollars for that. His revise provides $1 billion for that.
Anything else you think you and your colleagues would love to see put on the table when it comes to elements for education, whether it's linked learning or curriculum that's career-based in schools? What do you think?
Yeah, I think linked learning that links a career in the end with what students learning today really does motivate students and encourages them to stay in school, not drop out, because they see that they're learning geometry because there may be a job as a carpenter down the road, or maybe a job as an engineer after college down the road. It's good to have students have that longer view. So we would certainly support more funding targeted toward linked learning. And in higher education, I have a concern because the governor, while he was fairly generous with community colleges.
It sounds like he was, yeah.
In his May revise, he added an additional $50 million that will support student success. There was a task force that listed several programs that would help students be more successful. I strongly support Student Success Task Force recommendations, so I'm pleased with the governor in doing that. He also took away unit caps that he had originally proposed for community colleges, and I think that's a good thing. But what he didn't do is target money specifically to support students with disabilities or to support students who are economically, educationally disadvantaged. Now, it's interesting because in K-12 world, he said we need to put the money where it's most needed, but he just didn't follow suit with community colleges. So I have a bill,
yes.
Senate Bill 705, and what that bill does is it says we'll take $50 million, have $25 million go to disabled student service programs, $25 million to EOP programs, those with economic or educational disadvantages, to support those students in particular. We think it's in keeping with the governor's theme to help those who have the least. We wish the governor would have put that in his budget directly. He didn't. So my bill asked the governor to slow down the payback of deferrals from 4 years to 7 years, and with that additional money, fully fund these two important programs.
And these students have gone, these programs have gone without funding now for a couple of years, and wasn't most of their funding, it was pretty incredible compared to some of the funding cuts in some of the other parts of community colleges, right?
Yeah, they've been cut by about 40% in the last 4 or 5 years, and the way the governor has done his budget, individual community colleges can decide whether to fund them or not. The bill, by the way, is very supported by veterans groups because a lot of the folks coming to community colleges now with disabilities are those who are coming back from fighting for us in Iraq or Afghanistan and coming back with disabilities that they've encountered while overseas, mental disabilities, physical disabilities. It's only fair that we accommodate these people as, frankly, the Americans with Disability Act requires when they come to our community colleges.
So, in fact, the community colleges are sort of out of federal compliance as it stands right now, the way they're cutting back on these programs?
It could be, and in fact has been argued that we are out of compliance, and frankly could end up being liable for more dollars down the road if we don't pass SB 705.
Well, your bill's passed out of policy committee. It's passed out of the fiscal committee this week as we speak, now headed to the floor. Do you think that there's enough wiggle room for debating the money? And you look like you're about ready to tell us here.
Yeah, it hasn't passed out of fiscal yet.
Oh, it hasn't?
It's in appropriations right now.
Okay.
And we're working with the approps chair to hopefully get it out of approps. There are two ways we can accomplish what this bill sets out to do, get this money to these programs. One is through the bill, another is through the budget. I'm agnostic as to how we get there. We just need to get there to support folks with disabilities and economic disadvantages.
And you've heard some pretty compelling testimony, I know, as your bill has moved through policy committee with some of these students that are directly affected and see their access limited. So when we talk about equality, we're definitely talking about a sincere issue here.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about some of the other elements of higher education funding, because this is indeed a big part of this where so much funding has been cut and so much harm has been done. So from what I understand, we've got things pretty secured for a couple of years moving forward, including no tuition increases. Is that right?
Right. It looks like for the UC and CSU, there'll be guaranteed increases. And when I say guaranteed, that's depending on the bottom not falling out of our economy suddenly. But if things continue to go well, they have predictable increases in terms of general fund money that will go to both the CSU and the University of California in exchange for a promise from them not to raise student tuition and fees for the next 4 years.
So this is good news for K through 12, good news for higher ed, UC and CSU, and hopefully good news for community colleges.
Yeah, it should be great news for students at all levels in California.
All right, let's talk about some of the bigger overall budget issues. You've said the governor's listened to you, and you've seen some of the examples of that listening coming up here in his May revise. The Common Core was an example of that. But with all the relief and with lack of the hand-wringing this year and some of the kabuki dances that we've heard and seen over the last years with all of the ongoing budget debate, some of your colleagues are disappointed that because we have this surplus, that a lot of money isn't being taken to fill in where we've had these deep cuts. And the governor has said he's cautioned against new spending. In fact, he said everybody wants more spending. That's what this place is a big spending machine, and that's a turn of a phrase that he may hear about here in the next few weeks. But what do you say to that? Do you understand the governor's concerns that he's got to be fiscally prudent? But I understand you and your colleagues want to see some of these programs filled again.
Well, my colleagues who are very concerned with social service programs, very concerned with health care, very concerned with programs for the elderly, with child and infant care, rightfully so, are not seeing increases because of Prop 98, which is legislation from 40 years ago requiring dollars to go just to education. These other programs are getting somewhat shortchanged. I understand their desire. We wish there were a bigger pie so more money could be split. And hopefully, with the LEO's numbers coming in, and economists often disagree on numbers, we'll find there is more money, and hopefully some of these other programs can benefit.
Well, what do you say to people when they look at that as not so much just filling in what has been an empty cup, but they look at that as spending, as the governor says? What do you say in response to those who might look at it cynically?
All of us spend. Spending's not bad in and of itself as long as you spend within your means. If we find there are more dollars available, if the pie is bigger, then it's appropriate to spend money, particularly on some of these programs where if we don't spend money now on preventative health care, for example, then long-term costs for emergency room health care will be astronomical. We've got to spend less now so we don't have to spend more in the future.
All right, let's move forward with the timeline here between now and June 30th. The Speaker said just recently as the May revise came out that the disagreement range is pretty small. It sounds like a lot of these things can be fleshed out. The governor's willing to negotiate, so are the lawmakers. How do you think this will flesh out? What's the next step for those who may, again, not be familiar with our usual process here?
I think things should go fairly smoothly. Next week, the My Budget Subcommittee on Education will be meeting on Wednesday and Thursday. Then on Friday, the entire Budget Committee will meet. The other budget subs, I assume, will also be meeting earlier in the week. By the end of next week, we'll have a fairly good idea what the Senate response will be to the governor's May revise. Then we'll have the Assembly's response. They have a parallel process going on in the other house. The two houses will have to get together, decide what the legislative response will be, and then negotiate with the governor. Frankly, it comes down to the pro tem, the Speaker, and the governor in a room alone in mid-June coming up with a final agreement. A lot easier this year for a couple of reasons. Since the passage of Prop 25 a couple of years ago, We only need a majority vote to pass a good budget. And with 2/3 of both houses being Democrats, and with a Democratic governor now, and that's something we didn't have when I first got here, philosophically people are just more aligned. And if philosophically you're in agreement, it's easier to make the numbers work.
As a lawmaker, as a former educator, as a current educator, as a former college trustee, do you think California can thrive again? Do you think we've learned enough lessons to, if not repeat this next time a bad economy comes around, at least to be more prepared for it?
Yeah, I do think we've learned some important lessons, and the governor's right. One lesson we've learned is that we do need to be fiscally prudent. We can't spend more than we have. And we do need to put aside money for a rainy day. That's something we hadn't done well in the past. Having said that, what dollars we do have, we need to spend wisely now to help Californians in need.
Great. Thank you for the budget and education perspective, sir. We appreciate it.
Thank
State
you,
Senator Marty Block from the 39th Senate District down in San Diego. Appreciate you doing this. We'll talk again soon, I'm
Always
sure.
good to be here.
And that is it for this edition of Senate Spotlight. And we invite you to join us next time around as we discuss important legislative issues and policies with the newsmakers and newsbreakers of the California State Senate. From the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching Senate Spotlight.